Oh, g'day. Iron Horse back again with another update. I'm on a bit of a roll today, so I thought I'd just roll with it. Just had another massive squall of rain come through, so you could barely hear a thing. The next one I want to talk about is actually Eratosthenes. I touched upon that briefly in the second part. I think it's worth spending a whole 10 minutes on just discussing that alone, because as I did mention, at scale, because as we move, our sun seems to move with us, the sun should appear, as you'd expect, parallel lines. That's sort of the way it works. However, when you're 500 miles apart, or 800 stadia, which turns out a stadia must be a kilometre, because it's 800 kilometres is 500 miles, it appears that there's a 7.8 degree angle of difference. A stick, when there's no shadow cast in one spot, the stick 500 miles further to the, pretty sure it's to the west, it's casting a 7.8 degree shadow. So now the Eratosthenes tale has so many versions, it's not funny. Number one says they did it at the same time, so which means how can you communicate 500 miles apart? Back in 250 or 300 BC, they didn't have telephones or radios, couldn't even do smoke signal over that far of a distance. But what it's settled upon was that on a particular day when he was previously in Syene, he saw, looking down a well, no shadow was cast at midday. And of course we know time is measured by shadows of sticks. So obviously if you got a reasonably good sundial, and these guys are actually pretty good at measuring time, they also had the sand hourglass and they had measuring jugs, which as they would fill, would tip and pour, and that would sort of measure out the hours through the night time. So you weren't always 100% reliant upon the sun. So they were pretty clever people, these Greeks. They had a lot of good things worked out. So when you're looking down the well, cast no shadow. I believe it was on the summer solstice, but it could well be the equinox, just depends on how close to the equator they were. It's not particularly known or discussed too much in the experiment, except that it was said to have been done at the same time, or at least the same day a following year later. And you could go into technical details and say that because there's a quarter of a rotation out every year, it's never going to be quite the same. So you might have to wait like 30 years before you get it exactly the same. But we'll just leave that minor little detail out. The biggest one is how they measured the distance between them. There's multiple stories of that as well. The first one I always heard was that it was done in days of camel caravan travel, because these traders had a very set routine. They'd be up at the same time every day, loading up their camels, packing up their camps, and they would move a set distance every day. So once they knew exactly how many stadia they moved in one day, because they could measure that by how many hours it took to pass through across one, they could know how many stadia did per day, then how many days you did, would give you a fairly good estimate of the distance. The other one, of course, is we're told that he hired a servant, some of these people who were well trained to walk in exact steps. So if they walk in 1 yard or 1 metre per step, and they walked in a straight line, that was their job. Servant's a fancy name for slave. That's how they measured the distance that way. If you listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about the Eratosthenes experiment, he even mentions that they used the third well. If you watch Carl Sagan do his demonstration on cardboard, he uses 2 sticks, or obelisks, and he just curves the cardboard until one casts no shadow and the other one casts a bit of a shadow, and says the only way that can happen is on a curved earth. So there are that many different versions of the story, and not a single scrap of papyrus in recorded libraries history anywhere that actually were written by Eratosthenes, who was supposed to have been the head librarian of Alexandria, like the world's greatest library at the time. There's no recorded writings of him, and even many of the famous historians that existed back then who kept the records of stuff don't even mention him. So where we even get the story from in the first place does sort of suggest it could well be a fabrication. But if you think about it then, if he set out, instead of trying to measure the circumference of the Earth, because he's presumed that the Earth is a globe or spherical, because the Greeks obviously believed it wasn't in motion. They just believed it was spherical, even sitting on Atlas's back. Everything rotated around above us. So by measuring the angles of shadows on that particular day, had he instead have had the preconceived bias to think, what if the Earth is flat with a nearby local sun? And if I measured the angle difference from Syene to Alexandria at the same time on the same day and got a 7.8 degree difference, and I knew the distance between them, then I could use a formula to measure the height of the sun. And not only that, it would give you the circumference of its daily path. Think about that, because on the flat Earth, the equator is the daily sun's path, especially on the equinoxes. It's directly above the equator. So if you got the exact same results and you had a preconceived bias about what you were thinking you're going to set out to prove, you would find evidence to support the Earth is flat with a nearby local sun with a circumference of just slightly less than 25,000 miles. So Eratosthenes actually proves the flat Earth. You just have to interpret it with a more open mind.